Welcome to 20 Questions. With us today is Dan Diker, the Secretary General Designate for the World Jewish Congress. Thank you for being with us, Dan.
Thank you very much.
What are some of the more positive aspects of Obama's speech last night?
Well, the president's speech was really divided into two. The vast majority of the speech did not deal with Israel at all, but in fact laid out the president's vision for a reformed, more democratic, hopefully freer Middle East, which is currently engulfed in the flames of radicalism and revolution. And so perhaps it is positive that the president intends to pursue aggressively, in his words, reform, democracy, both not only political but economic reform, in a hope that the opposition movements in the Middle East will not end up becoming Muslim Brotherhood organizations and Muslim Brotherhood run governments, but in fact, hopefully the president stated we'll see that this ends up becoming the beginning of a new real democratic revolution for the region.
And what were some of the negative aspects? President
Barack Obama, in a watershed moment for Israel and for the Middle East, has exposed Israel to a very dangerous new diplomatic reality in which the President of the United States explicitly calls for Israel's return to what Israel, in every government since 1967, Labor or Likud or national unity governments, all have determined are indefensible borders along the 1967 lines. These 1967 lines are so fragile and so vulnerable, as you can see here on the map, that they are only fewer than 9 miles wide at the narrowest point, at Netanya. And as you can see, this would be, according to Mr. Obama, the future border of a Palestinian state. That would make Israel's waistline far too thin in order to avoid any kind of jihadi or terrorist infiltrations from the east. And let's remember that when we talk about the western border of a Palestinian state, those borders are on hilltops. Those are called the West Bank or the Judean Samarian Hill Ridge. Those are 3,000 feet above sea level, and therefore any child with an SA-7 rocket or firing a primitive Qassam rocket at Ben Gurion Airport or any of the other airports up and down the Mediterranean coast would put the vast majority of Israel's population in direct line of fire and create a strategic threat to the security and the existence of the State of Israel.
Do you think that Obama's speech marks a major shift in American policy?
Israel's right to defensible borders has been a long-standing position of U.S. administration since 1967, when the Security Council of the United Nations not only overwhelmingly but unanimously approved UN Security Council Resolution 242 of November 1967, which explicitly provided for Israel to have secure and recognized boundaries, which the Security Council at the time understood that Israel did not have. That is why Israel, as the entire world witnessed, was nearly defeated and overrun by 5 Arab countries in 1967. And since then, American administrations have been very clear, from Lyndon Baines Johnson to Richard Nixon to Gerald Ford to Warren Christopher, Secretary of State, to Secretary of State Schultz, to President Reagan, to President George W. Bush, that Israel is entitled to defensible borders to survive in this very unstable region, as we are currently witnessing.
Well, some people are arguing that his call to 1967 lines wasn't unequivocal. After all, he did allow accommodation for land swaps by mentioning it.
Well, by establishing the 1967 lines as the basis for any future negotiations, the president has essentially determined in large part two other core issues. One is the issue of settlements, because he didn't mention the issue of Jewish settlements or Jewish large population centers in Judea and Samaria, but by mentioning the 1967 lines as the basis, it by definition delegitimizes any Jewish population centers, or as is otherwise known, settlements east of the 1967 lines. So it automatically takes care of the American position on settlements.
What will be the outcome regarding the right of refugees?
In terms of the refugee issue, Mr. Obama's position took a fundamental shift away as well from certainly from the last administration, because Mr. Obama left the refugee issue symmetrical to the Jerusalem issue, also very troubling, till the end of negotiations, and neglected to take a principled position on the refugee issue. The refugee issue, from a U.S. point of view, has always been a non-starter, because that would be the end of the State of Israel by definition. The President, in his speech, did not take a principled position on the refugee issue, but basically left it hanging around Israel's neck for Israel to deal with opposite the Palestinians.
Do you think Obama's speech was ultimately just another way to prevent more impasses in negotiations?
Well, this is the major question. Was yesterday's far-reaching speech by the President of the United States essentially a quid pro quo for getting Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas to agree to come down off the tree and to move away from his intention to gain international endorsement at the United Nations for a Palestinian state unilaterally in September? This is a major question. There are some analysts believe that that's exactly what happened, that Mr. Obama had reached, according to their assessment, an agreement with the Palestinian leadership, and that this would essentially establish the goalposts, if you will, in terms of borders, and would, perhaps in Mr. Obama's view, satisfy the Palestinians' desire to know exactly what the blueprint looks like that would enable them to come back into negotiations.
Was Obama's intention simply to stall any negotiations?
It seems clear that Mr. Obama's intention is to derail the Palestinian unilateral plan for statehood. And it also seems clear that in order to do that, the President had to give something to the Palestinians that he perceived that they would value. The Palestinian leadership has been talking for some time now on their insistence that the 1967 lines be the border for the western side of their state, even though, and I repeat again emphatically, the 1967 line has no basis in international law or past diplomacy for Israel, but in fact was only the armistice lines at which the armies that were fighting Israel stopped fighting in 1948. That armistice line was negotiated at Rhodes, at the island of Rhodes, 1949, but it has no legal or diplomatic meaning whatsoever.
Can you tell us about the World Jewish Congress's role?
This particular issue of defensible borders for Israel is a Jewish issue of the greatest import, because it essentially impacts on the right of the Jewish people to self-determination and self-expression within secure and recognized boundaries of a Jewish nation-state. And the stakes are extremely high in this particular case, and the World Jewish Congress is going to play its role in coalescing Jewish communities around the world to state very clearly that the Jewish people will not go back to a situation where they will be unable to defend themselves, and that defense begins in the Jewish nation-state, and it extends, by extension, to communities around the world. The World Jewish Congress will take a leading role in advancing the issues that are absolutely vital for protecting, defending, and representing Jews wherever they may be.
Thank you very much for being with us, Mr. Diker.
Thank you very much.